Hello. Welcome to Twisted Stories, where intriguing and unexpected stories come to life. Please support the channel by following and sharing. Blackwood Manor, the outskirts of Connecticut. 4:30 in the afternoon. Lorenzo Blackwood, 36 years old, the ruthless kingpin who controlled half of the East Coast's underground pharmaceutical empire, returned home earlier than expected after a meeting was suddenly cancelled. His hand instinctively rested on the gun at his hip as he heard laughter echoing from the living room. Not ordinary laughter, the laughter of his daughter, Rosalie, a sound he had never heard so radiant and full of life. He moved silently toward the sound, and what he saw made him forget the weapon entirely. Made him forget he was the man the entire criminal underworld called the Cold King. His daughter, Rosalie, 4 years old, the child whom 12 of America's top neurologists had declared would spend her entire life in a wheelchair, was taking her first trembling steps toward the outstretched arms of Ava Mitchell, 27 years old, the nanny hired only 2 weeks before. Lorenzo stood frozen behind the door, tears streaming down the face that had made empires crumble and enemies beg for mercy. While his daughter, the little girl every specialist had deemed a hopeless case, was laughing and walking as if it were the most natural thing in the world. What he was about to discover about Ava, about her revolutionary methods, and about the secrets she carried from her own tragic past would forever change his understanding of medicine, of love, of redemption, and of miracles that emerge from the deepest darkness. In a world where Lorenzo Blackwood had everything except hope, one woman would prove that the greatest miracles are born not from power or wealth, but from love that refuses to surrender. If this story of impossible miracles and love that transforms lives has touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible stories. Share this with someone who needs to believe in miracles today. And stay tuned because what happens next will leave you breathless. 4 years ago, Blackwood Manor was not a place of tragedy, but a home overflowing with happiness. Catherine Blackwood, the woman with sunlit golden hair and clear blue eyes like an autumn lake, was the only light in Lorenzo's dark life. She was the daughter of an old aristocratic family in Boston, the only woman who ever dared to look straight into the eyes of the Cold King and tell him she wasn't afraid of him, only afraid that he might never learn how to love. Lorenzo fell in love with Catherine in that moment. In love with her courage, her gentleness, and her unshakable belief that somewhere inside his heart, there was still a part that darkness hadn't consumed. They were married in a quiet ceremony in the rose garden of Blackwood Manor, with only Marco Santini as a witness, and Lorenzo swore before Catherine that he would build a safe world for her and for the children they would have. When Catherine became pregnant, Lorenzo felt as though he had touched heaven. He reduced his work, spent more time at home, and even painted the nursery himself in soft pastel pink for the daughter they were expecting. Catherine often laughed and said she'd never seen a mafia boss so excited about choosing curtains and stuffed animals. But fate never allows men like Lorenzo Blackwood to be happy for long. On the night Catherine went into labor, everything began to go wrong from the very first moments. She went into premature labor at 32 weeks. The baby's umbilical cord wrapped tightly around her neck, cutting off oxygen throughout the delivery. The doctors raced against time, but Catherine's body was exhausted after hours of struggle. Lorenzo stood outside the operating room. A man who had ordered executions without blinking, now shaking like a helpless child. When the doors finally opened, the lead physician stepped out with an ashen face that said everything before he spoke a word. Catherine was gone. Her heart had stopped on the delivery table. Her fragile body unable to withstand the massive blood loss. The baby survived, but her brain had suffered severe damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Lorenzo couldn't remember how he reacted in those moments. He only remembered falling to his knees beside Catherine's lifeless body, gripping her hand as tears poured from him like they never had in all 32 years of his life. He had sworn to protect her. He had promised her heaven. Yet, in the end, he couldn't even keep her alive long enough to see their child's face. Rosalie spent the first 3 months of her life inside an incubator, her tiny body covered in wires and tubes, fighting to survive while her father stood outside with hollow eyes. When the doctors finally allowed Lorenzo to hold his daughter, he cried for the second time in his life. Rosalie was so small she fit entirely in one of his hands, her blue eyes identical to Catherine's, looking up at him as if asking why the world was so cruel. The months that followed became an endless journey from one specialist to another. From Boston to New York, from Los Angeles to Houston, Lorenzo spent millions of dollars searching for a sliver of hope. 12 of the top neurologists in the United States examined Rosalie, and all 12 delivered the same merciless conclusion. Cerebral palsy, irreversible motor cortex damage, zero chance of walking. Lorenzo converted the entire second floor of Blackwood Manor into a private medical facility filled with the most advanced equipment in the world. He hired specialists from Germany, brought in doctors from Switzerland, and even flew a research team from Japan, hoping they might find something Western medicine had missed. But all of them shook their heads. All of them told him he needed to accept reality and focus on giving Rosalie the best life possible within the limits of a wheelchair. Lorenzo Blackwood, the man who owned a multi-billion-dollar empire, who could buy politicians and make enemies disappear with a single phone call, realized there were things in this world money and power couldn't reach. He could kill 100 men. He could level a city, but he couldn't make his daughter's legs move. Every night after Rosalie had fallen asleep, Lorenzo sat alone in his study, staring at Catherine's photograph on his desk, wondering if she was disappointed in him. He had failed to protect his wife, and now he was failing to heal their daughter. The Cold King, the man who terrified the entire underworld, drifted into sleep each night with tears and a despair that had no escape. But in daylight, Lorenzo Blackwood was a completely different man. The moment he stepped beyond the gates of Blackwood Manor, he wrapped himself in the cold armor he had forged over more than a decade in the underworld. Blackwood Pharmaceuticals was the perfect front his father, Ricardo Blackwood, had created 30 years earlier. On the surface, it was one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations on the east coast of the United States, headquartered in Manhattan, employing more than 2,000 legitimate workers, and generating annual revenues in the billions of dollars. The company produced painkillers, cancer treatments, and medications that saved millions of lives each year. But behind the gleaming glass towers and sterile laboratories lay a shadow empire controlling half of the illegal pharmaceutical distribution routes from Boston to Washington. Refined heroin, high-grade cocaine, synthetic opioids. All of it flowed through a network the Blackwood family had built across 3 generations. Lorenzo inherited this empire at just 25 years old, shortly after his father was assassinated by a Russian gang seeking to seize control of the market. On the night Ricardo Blackwood collapsed in a pool of blood inside his own office, Lorenzo swore over his father's body that he wouldn't only take revenge, but would turn the Blackwood empire into a force no one would ever dare touch. And he did exactly that in the most brutal way imaginable. The nickname the Cold King didn't come by chance. It was born from the blood of those who dared to challenge Lorenzo Blackwood. In his first year of power, Lorenzo wiped out the entire Russian gang responsible for his father's death. 17 men, from the ringleader to the lowest level enforcers, all vanished without a trace. The police found no bodies. The FBI had no evidence, but the entire underworld knew what had happened. Lorenzo Blackwood didn't kill in fits of rage. He did it with the cold precision of a surgeon cutting out a malignant tumor. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't give his victims a chance to beg. He simply looked at them with steel-gray eyes, issued his orders in a flat, emotionless voice, and turned away before the gunshots echoed. It was that bone-chilling coldness that earned him the name the Cold King, the ice-crowned ruler with no heart. Marco Santini, Lorenzo's right-hand man since the earliest days, was one of the few who knew that behind the mask of ice was a man barely holding himself together. Marco had seen Lorenzo cry over his father's body, had watched him kneel beside Catherine's bed, had witnessed him holding Rosalie through entire nights in the hospital while she fought for her life. But Marco also understood that in this world, a single moment of weakness could mean death. So he kept silent, protecting his master's secret, making sure that no one beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor ever knew that the Cold King could cry. Every morning, Lorenzo left the estate at 7 o'clock, entrusting his daughter to a team of nannies and nurses. He presided over meetings where decisions involving millions of dollars and sometimes human lives were made as casually as discussing the weather. He met with politicians, bribed police officials, and negotiated with rival gangs over territory and market share. He built alliances with money and destroyed enemies with merciless efficiency. Once a business partner betrayed him, feeding information to the FBI in exchange for immunity. Lorenzo didn't get angry. He simply offered a thin smile when he heard the news. And 1 week later, the man was found inside his burned-out car on the outskirts of New Jersey along with his wife and 2 children. The underworld shuddered at the message. Betraying Lorenzo Blackwood meant not only you, but your entire family would pay the price. But every evening when Lorenzo returned to Blackwood Manor, when he entered Rosalie's room and saw his daughter sleeping in the specialized wheelchair beside her bed, all that ruthlessness melted away. He sat by her side for hours, telling the fairy tales Catherine had once loved, promising his daughter that he would find a cure, even if it meant burning the world to the ground. Rosalie often drifted to sleep while he was still speaking, and Lorenzo would remain there in the darkness, wondering if all the crimes he had committed were the reason heaven punished him by taking his wife and imprisoning his daughter in a wheelchair. The cold king could make an entire city tremble. But he couldn't make Rosalie's tiny legs move even a single step. With the relentless demands of running an underworld empire, Lorenzo couldn't always be by Rosalie's side, and that was why he needed a nanny. But finding the right person to care for the daughter of the cold king turned out to be harder than negotiating with the most violent gangs in the United States. Over the course of 4 years, 4 women entered Blackwood Manor as nannies, and all 4 left in different ways, leaving Lorenzo more desperate and Rosalie more withdrawn each time. The first was Margaret Collins, a 52-year-old woman with 30 years of experience caring for children with disabilities, recommended by a prestigious agency in New York. Her file was flawless, so perfect that Lorenzo believed he had finally found the right person. Margaret was professional, punctual, and followed every caregiving procedure for Rosalie exactly as written. She bathed Rosalie on schedule, fed her the correct portions, and carried out physical therapy exercises precisely according to the doctor's instructions. But Margaret lacked something no school could teach: warmth. She treated Rosalie like a patient to be managed, not a child who needed love. Rosalie cried every night during the 3 months Margaret was there. Silent tears she tried to hide because she didn't want to make her father sad. Lorenzo discovered it one night, when he returned late and heard muffled sobbing from his daughter's room. The next morning, Margaret was asked to leave with a generous severance payment and a cold warning from Lorenzo that she shouldn't ever mention the Blackwood family to anyone. The second was Rachel Turner, 28 years old, a young woman with a radiant smile and a sincere childlike affection. Rachel hugged Rosalie, played with her, told her stories, and sang her to sleep every night. For the first time in months, Rosalie began to smile again. And Lorenzo quietly thought he might have finally found the right person. But Rachel had no professional training in caring for a disabled child. She didn't know how to handle Rosalie's muscle spasms, didn't understand the necessary physical therapy routines, and once accidentally dislocated Rosalie's shoulder by lifting her incorrectly. Rosalie's piercing screams that night haunted Lorenzo for weeks afterward. He didn't fire Rachel, but she resigned on her own, unable to live with the guilt of having hurt the child she had come to love. The third was Diana Reeves, 35 years old, a pediatric nurse with experience at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Diana had both expertise and attentiveness, and Lorenzo believed this time would be different, but Diana lasted exactly 1 week. On the 7th night, after accidentally witnessing Marco Santini dragging a blood-soaked man into the mansion's basement, Diana understood who she was really working for. The next morning, she vanished without a word of farewell, leaving Rosalie's wheelchair abandoned in the middle of the living room and a 4-year-old child crying out for her name all day long. Lorenzo was furious, not because Diana left, but because she hadn't had the courage to at least say goodbye to a child who had begun to trust her. But the fourth was the true nightmare. Helena Volkov, 30 years old, with golden blonde hair and English spoken with a faint Eastern European accent, she explained came from growing up in Poland. Helena was suspiciously perfect, as professional as Margaret, as warm as Rachel, as skilled as Diana, and she showed no fear of her surroundings. She quickly won Rosalie's affection, and even made Lorenzo feel he could trust her. But Marco Santini, guided by instincts sharpened through decades of gang wars, sensed something was wrong. He quietly investigated and uncovered the horrifying truth. Helena Vulov was actually Yolena Clover, the cousin of Victor Klov, planted inside Blackwood Manor to gather intelligence and wait for the right moment to strike. Victor Klov, the man who had killed Lorenzo's father 11 years earlier, hadn't abandoned his ambition to destroy the Blackwood bloodline. On the night Marco reported his discovery, Lorenzo didn't say a word. He entered Helena's room while she slept, woke her, and looked into her eyes with a gaze as cold as ice. Helena didn't have time to beg or explain. The next morning, Victor Koslov received a package with no return address. Inside was the ring Helena always wore along with a handwritten note from Lorenzo that read, "Next time, send someone better." No one knows what happened to Helena, and no one dares to ask. But after that night, Lorenzo almost gave up hope of ever finding a suitable nanny. Rosalie would have to live with rotating teams of nurses and guards without a single woman to fill the place of the mother she had never known. But fate had arranged a meeting Lorenzo Blackwood could never have anticipated. And to understand the woman who would forever change his life in Rosalie's, we need to turn back time to a decaying slum in Baltimore where Ava Mitchell grew up surrounded by poverty and loss. Ava was born in a cramped apartment in the west side of Baltimore, a place people called America's Forgotten Land. The apartment had only 2 bedrooms and sat on the 5th floor of an aging building without an elevator, where hot water was a luxury and gunshots at night were as common as crickets in the countryside. Her father, Michael Mitchell, was a factory worker whose dreams of getting rich never came true. Her mother, Susan Mitchell, was a trainee nurse at the local hospital, a woman with hands rough from labor, but a heart that never stopped being warm. Ava's first 5 years were poor, but filled with love. She remembered sitting on her father's shoulders during Sunday walks in the park. Remembered the smell of apple pie her mother baked every birthday. Remembered the laughter of her family in a tiny but cozy kitchen. But everything changed when Ethan was born. Ava's younger brother came into the world on a stormy November night just as she turned 10. The labor lasted 18 hours. And when Ethan finally cried for the first time, the doctors already knew something was wrong. The baby boy had suffered oxygen deprivation during birth, leaving his brain severely damaged. The final diagnosis was cerebral palsy, exactly like Rosalie Blackwood 12 years later. But the Mitchell family didn't have millions of dollars to chase miracles. Michael Mitchell couldn't bear the truth that his son would never run and play like other children. He wasn't strong enough to face the mounting medical bills, the nightly cries when Ethan's muscles locked in painful spasms, the pitying looks from neighbors whenever they saw the cheap wheelchair Susan had bought on installment. 6 months after Ethan was born, Michael left. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye. He simply vanished one morning when Ava woke up and found her father's closet empty. Susan didn't cry in front of her daughter. But Ava, though only 6 years old, heard her mother's muffled sobs every night after the children had fallen asleep. From that day on, Susan Mitchell became the sole pillar of the family, raising 2 children, one healthy but too young to help, and one who required special care 24 hours a day. She worked 3 jobs just to survive. During the day, she worked 12-hour shifts as a nurse at the hospital. In the evenings, she cleaned offices for an insurance company downtown. On weekends, she did laundry for wealthier families in the area. The money she earned was barely enough to pay rent, buy food, and cover a small portion of the ever-growing medical bills. Ethan needed physical therapy, but insurance didn't cover enough. Needed muscle relaxants, but the medication was too expensive. Needed new wheelchairs as he grew, but specialized models cost half a year's rent. Susan had to choose between buying medicine for her son or school supplies for her daughter, between fixing a broken wheelchair or repairing a leaking water pipe. She always chose her son, and Ava, though still a child, never blamed her mother for it. Ava grew up faster than children her age. At 7, she knew how to change her brother's diapers, how to massage Ethan's legs when cramps seized his small body, how to sing him to sleep when her mother worked night shifts. At 9, she cooked meals for the family, washed clothes, and wheeled her brother outside every morning to sit in the sunlight, as the doctor had instructed. At 11, she began reading medical books her mother brought home from the hospital, trying to understand her brother's condition with the fragile hope that maybe she could find a way to help Ethan. Ava's childhood had no dolls, no pretty dresses, no birthday parties or trips to the park. Her childhood was sleepless nights beside her brother's bed during seizures. Afternoons spent reading to him while classmates played outside. Meals of nothing but bread and peanut butter because that was all they could afford. But Ava never resented her fate. She loved Ethan with her whole heart. Loved his crooked smile whenever he saw his sister. Loved the clear brown eyes that looked at her as if she were his entire world. Ethan couldn't speak clearly. Couldn't feed himself. Couldn't manage basic hygiene. But he could love. And the love he gave his mother and sister was the purest thing Ava had ever known. Every night before sleep, Ava whispered a promise to her brother. "One day I'll find a way to help you walk. I promise." She didn't know that promise would shape her entire life. And she didn't know fate was preparing to test her in the cruelest way imaginable. When Ava was 21 years old, the first tragedy struck like a storm without warning. Susan Mitchell, the woman who had carried the weight of the family for more than a decade, finally collapsed. Years of relentless labor, chronic sleep deprivation, rushed meals, and constant stress had drained her body completely. One March morning, Susan didn't wake up. Ava found her mother lying motionless in bed, her face pale yet peaceful, as if she had finally been allowed to rest after years of exhaustion. The doctor said her heart had stopped in her sleep, heart failure caused by prolonged overwork. Susan Mitchell passed away at the age of 42, leaving behind 2 children, a 21-year-old girl and an 11-year-old boy with cerebral palsy. Utterly alone in the world, Susan's funeral took place on a cold, rainy afternoon, attended by only a handful of neighbors and former co-workers. Ava stood beside her mother's coffin, gripping Ethan's hand as he sat in his wheelchair, and swore she wouldn't let her brother be sent to an orphanage, or a care facility. She would raise him herself, no matter the cost. The years that followed became a relentless battle against the world to keep that promise. Ava took a year off from her university studies to work full-time. Securing a job as a restaurant server during the day and cleaning offices at night, exactly as her mother once had. The money barely covered rent for a smaller apartment, food, and the most basic medications Ethan needed. She learned how to deal with social workers who came to inspect their living conditions. Learned how to fight through legal red tape to keep custody of her brother. I learned how to swallow her tears every night when her body ADHD with exhaustion, but she still had to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to care for Ethan before work. Ethan was the only force keeping Ava moving forward. The 11-year-old boy with an angelic smile had no idea his sister was sacrificing her youth for him. Didn't know Ava had turned down a college scholarship to stay home and care for him. Didn't know she cried every night in the bathroom from sheer exhaustion and despair. Ethan only knew that he loved his sister. And every time Ava came home after a long day, he would try with all his strength to offer that crooked smile, the one Ava always said was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. But fate didn't allow Ava to keep Ethan forever. When he was 12, a severe case of pneumonia took his life in just 2 weeks. His fragile immune system, weakened by years of being bedridden, couldn't fight the illness, and Ava watched helplessly as her brother slowly slipped away in the ward of a public hospital they were taken to because they couldn't afford better care. On the final night, Ethan held his sister's hand, his brown eyes looking at Ava with an oddly peaceful calm. He couldn't speak clearly, but Ava understood everything through that gaze. "Don't be sad for me. I love you. I'll be okay." Ethan Mitchell took his final breath at 3:17 in the morning in the arms of his 22-year-old sister, who had devoted her entire youth to loving and caring for him. Ava didn't cry when her brother died. She simply sat there holding Ethan's cold hand and felt a part of her soul leave with him. She had promised she would help him walk. Had promised she would find a way to heal him. But in the end, she couldn't. She had failed the most important promise of her life. 4 months after Ethan's funeral, Ava lived like an empty shell. She went to work, came home, sat alone in the silent apartment, and stared at her brother's wheelchair that she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Pain and guilt gnawed at her every day. And there were moments when she wondered if life still held any meaning at all. Then one night, while sorting through Ethan's old belongings, Ava found a crude drawing her brother had made for her years earlier. The picture showed 2 figures, one tall and one small, holding hands, and beneath it in shaky but clear letters were the words, "Ava is my superhero." Ava sank to the floor, clutching the drawing to her chest and cried as she never had before. She cried for Ethan, for her mother, for the childhood she had lost, for the years of struggle, for all the pain she had held inside for so long. And when the tears finally ran dry, when dawn began to break through the small window, Ava Mitchell made a decision that would change the rest of her life. She would become a pediatric physical therapy specialist. She would learn everything about cerebral palsy, about rehabilitation, about the methods she wished she had known while Ethan was still alive. She couldn't save her brother, but she would save other children. She would do it so Ethan could be proud of her, so her mother could be proud of her, and so she could ease the guilt that ate away at her heart every single day. Over the next 5 years, Ava worked and studied with unshakable determination. She attended night classes at a community college, then earned a scholarship to the physical therapy program at the University of Maryland. She graduated with top honors. Her thesis focused on motor rehabilitation methods for children with cerebral palsy, a technique she developed from everything she wished she had been able to do for Ethan. And now at 27, Ava Mitchell was searching for a new position after completing her previous contract. She didn't know that a prestigious agency in Connecticut was preparing to call her with an invitation to interview at a place called Blackwood Manor to care for a 4-year-old girl with cerebral palsy named Rosalie. The call from Elite Domestics came on a Saturday morning in early September. While Ava was sitting in the small rented apartment on the outskirts of Baltimore, staring at Ethan's photograph on the table and wondering if it was time to move to a new city and begin again, the woman on the other end spoke about a wealthy family in Connecticut looking for a nanny with pediatric physical therapy expertise for their 4-year-old daughter with cerebral palsy, offering a salary 3 times the market rate, full room and board, and comprehensive medical insurance. Ava was about to decline because it sounded too perfect to be real. But when the woman mentioned the child's condition, cerebral palsy caused by oxygen deprivation at birth, her heart tightened. It was exactly like Ethan. She agreed to the interview without asking anything else about the family, without researching who the Blackwoods were or why they were willing to pay so much. Maybe it was a mistake. Or maybe it was fate. The following Sunday morning, Ava stood before the towering iron gates of Blackwood Manor, with the only worn suitcase she owned and a heart pounding in her chest. She had seen large homes before while working for wealthy families in Maryland. But nothing had prepared her for what lay before her. Blackwood Manor wasn't a house. It was a Gothic castle with spires piercing the grey sky, ivy-covered stone walls, and a long cobblestone drive stretching endlessly to the front doors. Surrounding the estate were vast gardens with perfectly trimmed hedges, blooming rose bushes, and a marble fountain at the centre of the courtyard. What caught Ava's attention wasn't the luxury, but the men in black suits scattered throughout the grounds, their hands tucked into their jackets in a way she knew meant concealed weapons. She had grown up in the Baltimore slums. She recognized the posture of men who worked for the underworld. But Ava didn't turn back. She had come too far to walk away. And more importantly, there was a child with cerebral palsy waiting inside. Marco Santini greeted her at the main entrance. A 40-year-old man with a long scar across his right cheek and sharp eyes that assessed her from head to toe. He spoke little, guiding her through long corridors lined with antique paintings and crystal chandeliers. Finally stopping before a massive oak door, he called the boss's office. When Ava stepped inside, she saw Lorenzo Blackwood standing by the window with his back to her, looking out over the gardens. He didn't turn around immediately, leaving her standing in silence for nearly a full minute, an intimidation tactic Ava recognized, but refused to let affect her. When Lorenzo finally turned, Ava had to fight to maintain her composure. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, his physique carved like stone, black hair, slightly long and slicked back, and eyes of cold-tempered steel grey. He radiated a primal authority Ava had never encountered. An authority that didn't come from money or status, but from being a man who decided who lived and who died. Lorenzo looked at her without emotion and spoke in a low, icy voice, asking if she knew who he was. Ava lifted her chin and replied that she knew he was the father of a 4-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who needed care. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised by the answer. He stepped closer, standing less than a foot away, looking down at her with the same threatening gaze that had driven countless men to their knees. He said he would be direct, explaining that 4 women before her had failed, 1 had been cold to his daughter, 1 had lacked skill and injured the child. 1 had fled like a coward, and 1 had been a spy planted to harm his family. He paused, grey eyes drilling into Ava, as if trying to see into her soul, and warned that if she harmed Rosalie, even a single hair, she would vanish from the face of the earth, and no one would ever find her body, asking if she understood. Any other woman would have trembled, would have asked to leave, would have run as far from Blackwood Manor as possible. But Ava Mitchell wasn't just any woman. She had survived the Baltimore slums, had raised her brother with cerebral palsy alone since 16, had watched her mother and brother die in her arms, and still stood back up. She wasn't afraid of death. She was only afraid of being unable to help children like Ethan. Ava met Lorenzo's icy grey eyes without blinking, her voice calm like a still lake, saying she wasn't afraid of him. Mr. Blackwood, only afraid she wouldn't be able to help Rosalie, and that if he wanted to know who she was, he should let her meet his daughter instead of sitting there threatening her. The room fell into a tense silence that stretched for 10 long seconds. Lorenzo studied Ava with confusion, as if trying to understand what kind of woman dared speak to the cold king that way. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not a warm smile, but a rare sign of respect. He called Marco and told him to take Miss Mitchell to see Rosalie. Rosalie's room was on the 2nd floor, decorated in soft pastel pink and white with butterflies and flowers painted on the walls. The little girl sat in a pink wheelchair by the window, long black hair falling over her shoulders, blue eyes like the ocean gazing out at the garden with a sadness far beyond her years. When she heard the door open, Rosalie turned with the guarded look of a child who had been hurt too many times. Ava didn't approach right away. She knelt at the doorway, lowering herself to Rosalie's eye level, and smiled gently. She greeted her softly, saying her name was Ava, and that she had heard Rosalie had a beautiful doll collection, asking if she could see it. Rosalie hesitated, studying Ava with cautious blue eyes. She had met too many adults who looked at her with pity or fear. But this woman was different. Ava's warm brown eyes held no pity and no fear, only pure sincerity and a deep sadness that somehow felt familiar to Rosalie. A minute passed, then another. Finally, Rosalie slowly guided her wheelchair toward Ava, and for the first time in months, she smiled at a stranger. She introduced herself quietly and said she had many dolls, asking which one Ava wanted to see first. Lorenzo stood outside the room, watching everything in silence. He saw his daughter, usually withdrawn and afraid of strangers, happily showing Ava each doll, as if they had known each other their entire lives. His frozen heart felt a flicker of warmth for the first time in years. That night, Lorenzo hired Ava without asking another question about methods or philosophy. He didn't know he was making a decision that would forever change the lives of all three of them. On her clear's throat first official day of work at Blackwood Manor, Ava woke at 5 in the morning before the sun had risen over the hills of Connecticut. She spent an entire hour sitting in the room prepared for her, Clear's throat, rereading Rosalie's complete medical file that Lorenzo had provided, studying every report from the 12 neurologists, every MRI and CT scan result, every note left by previous physical therapists. All of them reached the same conclusion. Irreversible motor cortex damage, zero chance of walking, and a recommendation to focus on improving quality of life rather than pursuing impossible goals. Ava closed the file and smiled. She had heard the same words about Ethan. And although her brother had ultimately never walked, Ava knew the true limits of a child weren't written in medical reports, but in the beliefs of the people surrounding them. If everyone believed Rosalie couldn't walk, the child would never try. But if even one person believed a miracle was possible, everything changed. The first thing Ava did was remove the words training and therapy entirely from Rosalie's life. At 4 years old, Rosalie was already too familiar with being placed on therapy tables, forced to repeat movements while adults hovered nearby with serious faces and clipboards. She hated those sessions, hated feeling like a broken patient instead of a child who needed love. So Ava turned everything into play. That morning, after breakfast, Ava wheeled Rosalie into the large playroom on the second floor and declared that from now on, this room would be their magic kingdom. She spread a large soft pink mat across the floor, placed colorful pillows around it, and began telling Rosalie about legs that could fly. Ava leaned close and whispered like she was sharing a great secret, telling her that every pair of legs had magic inside, but the magic was asleep and needed special songs to wake it up. Rosalie's blue eyes widened, for the first time, showing interest in anything related to her legs. Ava lifted her onto the mat, gently placed Rosalie's small legs across her lap, and began singing a playful rhyme while softly massaging each toe, each foot, each calf. It wasn't called clinical massage. It was a game called Waking Up Sleepy Toes. And Rosalie giggled every time Ava pretended a toe had just woken up and waved hello. Then came the game of making legs fly like butterflies, where Ava gently lifted and lowered Rosalie's legs in rhythm with a song about butterflies in the garden. Rosalie didn't know it was passive motor therapy designed to stimulate circulation and maintain joint flexibility. She only knew it was the most fun she'd ever had, and that the adult playing with her didn't look at her with pity. In the afternoon, Ava changed tactics. Instead of pushing Rosalie's wheelchair like everyone before her, she encouraged the little girl to control the pink chair herself. Every trip through the manor became an adventure. Princess Rosalie steering her magical carriage on a treasure hunt. The treasure might be a teddy bear hidden in the corner of the living room, a beautiful painting in the hallway, or a flower in the garden Ava had placed earlier. Rosalie eagerly pushed the wheels with both hands, unaware that each push was strengthening her arm and shoulder muscles. After a week, her arms were noticeably stronger, and more importantly, she began to feel she had control over part of her life instead of depending entirely on others. But the evenings were the most magical of all. After bath time and pajamas, Ava laid Rosalie in bed and began telling bedtime stories she invented herself. Tales of the Theatre of the Toes. In that world, each of Rosalie's toes was a character with its own name, personality, and story. The big toe was Captain Brave, the second toe was Princess Dancer, the middle toe was Tall Knight, the fourth toe was Shy Girl, and the little toe was the Mischievous Baby. Each night, Ava told a new adventure about these characters, and instinctively, Rosalie began to move her toes along with the story. When Captain Brave stepped forward to protect his friends, Rosalie's big toe twitched. When Princess Dancer spun in circles, the second toe wiggled softly. They were tiny movements, almost imperceptible. But Ava saw them all. Each movement was proof that Rosalie's brain was still trying to connect with her legs, that the neural pathways weren't completely destroyed, as the doctors had claimed. Lorenzo occasionally stood outside the room watching Ava and Rosalie in silence. He heard his daughter's laughter. Saw her eagerly waiting each morning to play the magic games with Ava. Saw her eyes light up every time the new nanny entered the room. Part of him wanted to believe Ava could create miracles. But another part, the part crushed by reality over the past 4 years, warned him that all of this was only a beautiful illusion. The best doctors in the United States had said Rosalie couldn't walk, and a nanny with a few children's games couldn't change science. But Lorenzo didn't interfere because for the first time in 4 years, his daughter was truly happy. The second week began, and Lorenzo Blackwood grew increasingly uneasy with what he was witnessing. Every morning, he saw Ava and Rosalie playing on the pink mat in the playroom. Laughter echoing through the corridors, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Every afternoon, he saw his daughter eagerly pushing her wheelchair through the manor, shouting with joy about the treasures she had discovered. Every evening, he stood outside the bedroom door, listening to Ava tell absurd stories about talking toes, while Rosalie laughed like she had never laughed before. It was all beautiful, warm, and full of light. Yet, Lorenzo couldn't shake the feeling that these were meaningless games, nurturing false hope in his daughter's heart. One afternoon, Lorenzo summoned the family's private physician, Dr. Richard Hayes, to Blackwood Manor to examine Rosalie. He wanted scientific proof that Ava's games were producing no real results, so he would have a reason to end it all before Rosalie was hurt by inevitable disappointment. Dr. Hayes, a 60-year-old man with white hair and sharp eyes, had followed Rosalie's condition since her birth. He conducted the usual tests, measuring reflexes, checking muscle tone, evaluating motor function, everything he had done dozens of times over the past 4 years. But this time, as he reviewed the results, his expression changed. Lorenzo asked what was wrong, his voice tight. Dr. Hayes remained silent for a long moment, rereading the numbers as if he couldn't trust his own eyes, then finally looked up at Lorenzo with visible confusion. He said Rosalie's muscle tone had improved noticeably compared to the examination 3 months earlier. Her arm and shoulder muscles were stronger, which could be explained by her pushing the wheelchair more often. But what surprised him was that her leg muscles were also showing signs of improvement, however slight. Lorenzo stood frozen. He asked what the doctor meant. Dr. Hayes quickly added that he wasn't saying Rosalie would walk. The neurological damage was still there and science still said full recovery was nearly impossible. But small changes were occurring. Changes he couldn't explain with conventional therapy. He asked what the new nanny was doing with the child. Lorenzo didn't answer. He simply stood there looking out the window where Ava was pushing Rosalie through the rose garden. And for the first time in 4 years, a fragile spark of hope flickered inside his hardened heart. But he didn't dare grasp it. Didn't dare believe it. Because he had hoped too many times before and had been crushed by reality every time. That night, Lorenzo returned home late after a tense meeting with business partners. He was exhausted, his mind heavy with life and death decisions from the underworld, and all he wanted was a glass of whiskey and silence. But as he passed Rosalie's room, he heard his daughter's soft voice and stopped. Rosalie asked Ava, her voice sleepy yet full of curiosity, if she thought one day Rosalie would be able to walk. Really walk, not just in dreams. Lorenzo's heart tightened. He stood silently outside the slightly open door, barely breathing, waiting for Ava's answer. Ava's gentle voice replied, telling Rosalie she would share a secret. She said she once had a younger brother named Ethan, Clear's throat, who like Rosalie couldn't walk. And every night she had promised him she would find a way to help him walk. Rosalie whispered and asked if he ever did. There was a long pause. Lorenzo could hear Ava take a deep breath, as if holding back emotion. Ava said Ethan had gone to a very distant place before she could help him, but that he had taught her many things. He taught her that miracles weren't something that happened overnight. That miracles were built day by day through small steps, small smiles, and never giving up. She said she believed Rosalie had magic inside her, and that she could feel it. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then her voice rose, clear and filled with determination, so strong that Lorenzo had to steady himself against the wall. She said that when she could walk, she would run to hug her father first, that she wanted him to see her walk, that she wanted him not to be sad anymore. Lorenzo didn't remember how long he stood there after Rosalie fell asleep. He only knew that when he finally returned to his study, the glass of whiskey was untouched on the table, and for the first time in many years, the Cold King cried, not from grief, but because something he had believed lost forever was slowly coming back to life in his chest. Hope. The next day, Lorenzo didn't go to work. He stayed home, sitting in the living room, watching Ava play with Rosalie, observing every small movement of his daughter's legs, and for the first time allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this woman truly could create a miracle. And then that moment arrived on the afternoon of the 14th day, when Lorenzo Blackwood returned home earlier than expected and witnessed what 12 of the top neurologists in the United States had sworn would never happen. His daughter Rosalie, the child declared destined to live in a wheelchair for life, was taking her first unsteady steps. After standing frozen behind the door with tears streaming down his face, Lorenzo stepped into the living room, and Rosalie saw him. Her blue eyes lit up like stars. And in the clearest voice she possessed, she cried out, "Dad, look at me. I can walk. I can walk." Then Rosalie let go of Ava's hand, turned toward her father, and began to move toward Lorenzo. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Each step trembling yet determined. Each step a miracle Lorenzo had believed he would never live to see. She fell into his arms and Lorenzo dropped to his knees, holding his daughter tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, it would all dissolve into a dream. His shoulders shook, sobs, breaking free from the throat of the man the underworld called the Cold King. He cried like a child. Cried as he hadn't since the day Catherine died. Cried for 4 years of despair, for countless sleepless nights beside his daughter's bed. For every prayer he had believed went unanswered. "I did it, Dad," Rosalie whispered against his ear, her small arms wrapped around his neck. "I promised you that when I could walk, I would run to hug you first. I kept my promise." Lorenzo held her for a long time, unable to speak, letting tears flow freely down a face that had forgotten what it felt like to cry. Ava stepped back quietly, watching the sacred moment between father and daughter, tears slipping down her own cheeks. She saw Ethan and Rosalie, saw the miracle she had wished her brother could have received. And though her heart ached with longing, she felt a pure happiness bloom inside her chest. She had done it. She had kept her promise to Ethan, not with him, but through another child who needed her. That night, after Rosalie had fallen into a deep sleep with a smile still lingering on her lips, Lorenzo sought out Ava. She was sitting alone on a bench in the rose garden, gazing up at the star-filled sky, dried tear tracks still visible on her face. Lorenzo stood a few steps away, unsure what to say. He was a man who could order deaths without blinking, who could negotiate million-dollar deals in an icy voice. Yet, standing before this woman, he suddenly felt he was no longer the Cold King. He was just a father who had witnessed a miracle, and he didn't know how to say thank you. "You did the impossible," Lorenzo finally said, his voice from the day's events. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Ava turned to look at him, her brown eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "You don't owe me anything. Rosalie did this herself. I only helped her believe it was possible." Lorenzo stepped closer and sat beside Ava, near enough to feel her warmth, yet far enough to keep respect intact. He was silent for a long moment, then asked the question he had carried for days. "Who is Ethan?" Ava drew a deep breath and began to tell her story. She spoke of a childhood marked by poverty in Baltimore. Of a father who left when she was young, of a mother who collapsed from exhaustion when Ava was 16. She spoke of Ethan, the brother with cerebral palsy she had cared for alone for 6 years. Of the promise to help him walk that she couldn't fulfill, of the night he took his last breath in her arms, and the guilt that had haunted her ever since. When Ava finished, she realized Lorenzo was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the cold gaze of a mafia boss, not the threatening eyes of the Cold King, but the look of a man seeing his own soul reflected in another. "I lost the woman I loved, too," Lorenzo said, his voice so soft the wind almost carried it away. And then he told Ava about Catherine, about the first and last love of his life, about the night his wife died on the delivery table and left Rosalie in his arms, about 4 years of raising a child alone while running an underworld empire. About the despair that gnawed at him every night, as he watched his daughter sit in her wheelchair. 2 broken people, 2 scarred souls, sat side by side in the rose garden under the moonlight, opening their hearts to a stranger for the first time. When Lorenzo finished, Ava gently placed her hand over his, a simple gesture holding more meaning than words ever could. "Catherine would be proud of you," Ava said softly. "And Ethan would be proud of you," Lorenzo replied. They sat there in silence until dawn began to tint the horizon pink, needing no more words, finding that each other's presence was enough. And in that moment, neither of them realized that their hearts were beginning to intertwine in a way that would forever change both of their lives. In the weeks that followed that miraculous moment, Blackwood Manor seemed illuminated by a kind of light it had not known for 4 long years. Rosalie progressed day by day in ways that made even Dr. Hayes shake his head in disbelief at every examination. From the first 3 unsteady steps, she gradually managed 10 steps, then 20, then crossed an entire room without anyone supporting her. The pink wheelchair was pushed into a corner, then moved down to the basement, and finally, Rosalie asked her father whether they could give it to another child who needed it because she no longer did. 1 month after those first steps, Rosalie began to run. Not fast, not far. But she ran, the small legs, once declared permanently paralyzed, now striking the floor in eager, hurried steps. She ran through the manor, ran in the garden, ran to hug her father every time he came home. And every time Lorenzo heard the sound of his daughter's footsteps, he had to pause for a moment to remind himself that this was not a dream. But the greatest change was not in Rosalie. It was in Lorenzo himself. The cold king, the ruthless lord of the underworld, was slowly melting. He began coming home earlier, cancelling unimportant meetings so he could make it to dinner with his family. He sat on the playroom floor, joining the magic games Ava invented, following the instructions of a 4-year-old girl without feeling diminished. His men started whispering about this strange transformation. Marco Santini remarked that his boss had smiled during a meeting, something that had never happened in the 11 years he had known Lorenzo. Some worried that the cold king was growing weak, but Marco knew the truth. Lorenzo was not weakening. He was reclaiming the humanity he believed he had buried with Catherine. And the source of that change was not only Rosalie, but Ava as well. Lorenzo realized he began searching for Ava with his eyes whenever he entered a room. He noticed his heart beating faster when he heard her laughter echo down the hallway. He found himself lying awake at night, not because of empire problems, but thinking of her warm brown eyes, of the stories she told in the rose garden, of the hand she placed over his that night. He was not a man who believed in love at first sight. He had loved Catherine, a love built slowly over years together. But with Ava, everything was different. She did not try to win him over. She was simply herself. And Lorenzo was drawn to her, as if into an irresistible current. 3 months after Rosalie took her first steps. On an autumn night, when the leaves were turning gold and amber, Lorenzo found Ava standing alone in the rose garden, at the very spot where they had spoken that first night. She was looking up at the star-filled sky, and Lorenzo realized she was crying. He stepped closer, concerned, and asked what was wrong. Ava turned hurriedly, wiping her tears, and said it was nothing, only that she had just realized it was Ethan's birthday, and if he were still alive, he would have been 17. Lorenzo stood beside her, unable to find words to say the pain he knew would never truly heal. Instead, he did something the cold king would never have done before. He pulled Ava into his arms and held her tightly, letting her cry against his shoulder without a single word. They stood there in the rose garden under the moonlight, 2 broken people finding wholeness in each other. When Ava finally lifted her head, her eyes red as she looked into Lorenzo's. He could not hold back any longer. He spoke her name, his voice with emotion, and told her he was not good at saying such things. That he had lived his life in darkness, doing things she should never know, that he did not deserve her or the goodness she brought into his family. But he could not continue pretending she was only his daughter's nanny. He told her he loved her, that he had loved her since the night he heard her speak of Ethan. Loved her for the way she looked at Rosalie, as if the child were her entire world. Loved her because she was the only person who saw him not as the cold king, but as a man trying his best to be a father. Ava remained silent, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he could hear it. She knew she had feelings for him, too. Had known for a long time, but had been afraid to admit it even to herself. At last, she whispered that she felt the same. But she was afraid, not of him, but of losing everything they had built. Because Rosalie needed stability, and she did not want to ruin that. Lorenzo gently lifted Ava's chin and made her meet his eyes. He told her he would wait for as long as she needed, but she had to know that she was not only healing Rosalie, she was healing him as well. And there in the rose garden under the cold autumn moon, Lorenzo Blackwood found again the capacity to love that he believed had died with Catherine 4 years earlier. But happiness was never allowed to last long in the world of Lorenzo Blackwood. The darkness he believed he had briefly forgotten was quietly rising again, and it carried a name Lorenzo despised more than anything else in this world. Victor Korff. One morning in early December, as Ava was preparing to take Rosalie out to the garden as usual, she opened the mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, and the moment Ava saw it, the blood in her veins seemed to freeze solid. The photo showed her and Rosalie playing in the rose garden the day before, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, clearly shot from a position outside the estate grounds. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message in red ink that looked like blood, saying that the most precious things are often the easiest to break and asking Lorenzo how fragile his daughter had been. Ava ran into the house to find Lorenzo, her hands shaking as she held the photograph out to him. She had never seen his face change so fast. The tenderness he wore when he looked at her vanished instantly, his eyes turning to ice, his jaw clenching tight. And in that moment, Ava saw the cold king for the first time. Not Lorenzo, the gentle father she had come to know over the past months, but the ruthless mafia lord who terrified the underworld. Lorenzo immediately summoned Marco Santini and issued orders in a voice stripped of all emotion. He said Clov had found them, that Unclear's throat security was to be tripled, that no one was to enter or leave the estate without his permission, and that Ava and Rosalie were not to step beyond the gates until he dealt with this. Marco nodded and rushed off to carry out the commands, while Ava stood there in confusion and fear. She asked Lorenzo what was happening and who Koslov was. Lorenzo remained silent for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. At last, he exhaled and guided Ava to sit down, his voice low, as if recounting a nightmare he could never escape. He told her Viktor Clov was a Russian mafia boss, the sworn enemy of the Blackwood family. 13 years earlier, Viktor's older brother, Alex Clov, had tried to seize his father's empire. They ignited a brutal gang war that lasted 2 years, leaving dozens dead on both sides. In the end, his father had won by killing Alex in a gunfight at the Boston Harbor. Lorenzo paused, his eyes staring into empty space, as if reliving those dark memories. He said Viktor had been nothing more than a low-level enforcer at the time. But he had sworn over his brother's body to wipe out the entire Blackwood bloodline. 2 years later, Viktor fulfilled that vow. Lorenzo's father was assassinated inside his own office by a gunman Viktor had planted among their ranks. That was the day Lorenzo was 25, the day he inherited the empire and was forced to become the Cold King to protect what remained. Ava listened, her heart aching as she realized how much Lorenzo had carried for so many years. She whispered Helena's name. Lorenzo confirmed that Helena Vulov, the fourth nanny, had been Viktor's cousin, planted to gather intelligence and wait for the right moment to strike. He said that if Marco hadn't uncovered the truth in time, Rosalie might have been taken, or worse, he did not finish the sentence. But Ava understood. She had known about Helena from Lorenzo's earlier stories, but only now did she grasp the true danger. Viktor Koslov didn't just want Lorenzo dead. He wanted to destroy everything Lorenzo loved before killing him. Lorenzo Clear's throat explained that after Helena was dealt with, Viktor had gone silent for nearly a year. He believed Viktor had either given up or was planning something new. But the photograph proved Viktor had been watching them all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Lorenzo stood and pulled Ava into his arms, his voice heavy with fear and resolve. He told her that she and Rosalie were everything he had left, and if anything happened to them, he would burn the entire world to the ground. In the days that followed, Blackwood Manor transformed into an impregnable fortress. The number of guards tripled. Surveillance cameras were installed in every corner, and trained dogs patrolled day and night. Rosalie didn't understand why she was no longer allowed to play in the garden, why her father always seemed tense, why there were so many men in black everywhere. Ava did her best to keep life as normal as possible, continuing the magic games indoors, continuing the bedtime stories of the Theatre of the Toes each night, but she knew Lorenzo was fighting a dangerous enemy beyond these walls. And every night she prayed he would return safely. Lorenzo spent nearly all his time hunting Viktor, mobilizing his entire intelligence network to locate where he was hiding. But Viktor Koslov was a seasoned predator. He had waited 11 years for revenge, and he wasn't easy to track. The only thing Lorenzo was certain of was that Viktor was planning a major attack, and he had to find him before it was too late. But he didn't know that it already was. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon while Lorenzo was in Manhattan for a business meeting he couldn't cancel. It was the greatest mistake of his life. Leaving Blackwood Manor even for a single day, Viktor Koslov had waited for this exact moment, and he struck with a brutality that only 11 years of hatred could cultivate. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the manor security system was suddenly paralyzed. Cameras went dark, the automatic gate swung open, and the alarms fell silent. Marco Santini realized instantly that there was an insider. Someone within had disabled the entire defense system. He managed to shout a warning just before the first gunshots rang out, tearing through the peaceful air of Blackwood Manor. 15 gunmen flooded the estate from 3 different directions. Armed with submachine guns and body armor, this was not a spontaneous attack. It was a military-style operation planned meticulously over months. Lorenzo's guards were caught off guard. Some fell in the first wave of bullets. The rest struggled to organize a defense, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Marco Santini fought like a lion, defending his territory. He planted himself at the main entrance, dropping 3 attackers before a bullet tore through his right shoulder. Blood poured out, but Marco didn't stop. He kept firing with his left hand, buying time so Ava and Rosalie could escape. He shouted into his radio, his voice breaking with pain, telling Ava to take Rosalie to the safe room immediately. Ava heard the gunfire and knew exactly what was happening. She didn't panic or scream. Survival instincts forged during years in the Baltimore slums trained her for moments like this. She ran to Rosalie's room, where the little girl was crying in terror at the sound of gunshots outside. Ava scooped Rosalie into her arms, held her tight against her chest, and ran toward the hidden safe room Lorenzo had shown her during her first week at the manor. The room was concealed behind a large mirror in the master bedroom, designed to withstand even explosives, and stocked with enough oxygen for 2 people for 48 hours. Ava slid the mirror aside, carried Rosalie inside, and sealed the thick steel door behind them. Rosalie sobbed in her arms, blue eyes wide with fear. She asked what was happening, why there were gunshots, where her father was. Ava held her close, forcing her voice to stay calm, even as her heart felt like it might burst. She told Rosalie everything was going to be okay, that bad people were trying to get into the house, but her father would protect them. She told her to be brave, reminded her of what Uncle Marco had said, that real princesses know how to stay calm when danger comes. Rosalie nodded, swallowing her sobs, tiny hands clutching Ava's clothes. Outside, the gunfire continued, each shot slicing into Ava's heart. She thought of Marco, of the guards fighting to protect them, of Lorenzo hundreds of miles away, surely losing his mind with fear. But there was nothing she could do except keep Rosalie safe. That was her only mission now. 15 minutes passed, like 15 hours. The gunfire grew less frequent, and Ava didn't know whether that was a good sign or a terrible one. Then she heard footsteps outside the room. The sound of someone tearing through the master bedroom, shoving furniture aside. Searching, she tightened her hold on Rosalie, covering the child's mouth so she wouldn't make a sound. Ava's heart nearly stopped when she heard a man's voice, thick with a Russian accent and dripping with malice. He ordered them to find them, saying he knew they were somewhere inside, mocking Blackwood for thinking he could hide his family from him, declaring that he had waited 20 years for this moment. Victor Clove was inside the manor. Ava heard him command his men to search every room, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found the safe room. She scanned the space, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. But the room was designed for hiding, not fighting. There was nothing but a flashlight, a few bottles of water, and an emergency radio Lorenzo had said to use, only if absolutely necessary. Then the sound stopped right in front of the mirror. Victor's voice rang out with triumph as he announced they had found it, the safe room, boasting that his insider had mapped the entire manor months ago. Ava heard them begin to breach the door, the pounding of tools, the drill biting into metal. She knew the steel door wouldn't hold forever if they had the right equipment. She set Rosalie down in the farthest corner of the room, knelt in front of her, and looked straight into the child's eyes. Speaking with absolute seriousness, she told Rosalie that no matter what happened, she had to stay there and not come out, that Ava would protect her. Then Ava stood, turned to face the door being forced open, her hands gripping the flashlight, as if it were her only weapon. She had no gun, no knife, nothing that could stop the armed men outside, but she had the resolve of a woman protecting the child she loved as her own. She would die before letting anyone lay a hand on Rosalie. The steel door shuttered violently under the hammer blows and the scream of the drill, metal bending inward, and Ava knew she had only minutes left before Victor Kosloff broke through. She stood in front of Rosalie, her slender body the only shield between the child and the killers outside. Rosalie cried silently in the corner, blue eyes locked on Ava with absolute trust that she would be protected. And it was that look that gave Ava the strength not to tremble. Then the door burst open. Victor Kosloff stepped inside. A man in his mid-40s with closely cut silver hair, a long scar running across his left cheek, and grey eyes as cold as Siberian ice. He laughed when he saw Ava standing in front of Rosalie, the flashlight in her hand looking so pitiful it was almost tragic. He mocked her, asking if this was the protector of the Blackwood family, a nanny with a flashlight, sneering that Blackwood had truly grown weak. He motioned for the 4 remaining gunmen to enter the room, surrounding Ava from all sides. Victor moved closer, his gaze settling on Rosalie trembling in the corner. He remarked that the child looked just like her mother, that Catherine had once looked at him with the same blue eyes the first time he met her, and that it was a shame she died before he had his chance. Ava didn't think she acted. She swung the flashlight at Victor, but he blocked it easily and slapped her hard enough to send her crashing to the floor. Rosalie screamed and tried to run to Ava, but one of the gunmen blocked her. She shouted for them not to touch her. Her small legs that once couldn't move now kicking wildly at the man's legs, begging them not to hurt her. Ava, Victor watched with a twisted fascination. He said it was interesting that the cerebral palsy child could walk now, that Blackwood must be thrilled, but that the joy was about to end. He drew his gun and aimed it straight at Ava's head as she lay on the floor. He declared that he would kill Ava first so the child could watch, then kill the child. And when Blackwood returned home, he would find the bodies of those he loved most, calling it the perfect revenge. Victor pulled the trigger, but instead of a gunshot, there was only the sound of metal striking metal. A bullet from behind knocked the gun from Victor's hand before he could fire. Everyone turned to see Lorenzo Blackwood standing in the doorway, his gun still smoking, grey eyes burning with the fire of hell. He was home. Lorenzo didn't say a word. He fired continuously, dropping 2 gunmen before they could react. The third returned fire, a bullet tearing through Lorenzo's left shoulder, blood spraying across his white shirt. But Lorenzo didn't stop. He kept advancing like a creature that didn't feel pain, shooting the third and fourth men with 2 precise shots to the head. Only Viktor Koslov remained. The lifelong enemies faced each other in the safe room turned battlefield. Victor laughed madly and pulled a backup gun from his waistband, declaring that Blackwood's father had killed his brother, and that he had killed Blackwood's father, and now he would finish it by killing Lorenzo and his family. Lorenzo told him he wouldn't touch them, that he would have to step over his dead body first. His voice cold as steel, even as blood soaked his arm. Victor fired, but Lorenzo moved. The 2 men collided in a brutal fight. Gunfire mixing with fists and kicks. Lorenzo's shoulder screamed with every movement, but he fought as if there were no tomorrow. Because for him, if he lost this fight, there wouldn't be one. Victor struck Lorenzo's wounded shoulder, forcing him down to one knee. Victor raised his gun, triumphant, saying it was over after 20 years of waiting. But Lorenzo wasn't looking at Victor. He was looking at Ava and Rosalie clinging to each other in the corner, his daughter's eyes filled with terror and tears. And in that moment, Lorenzo remembered Rosalie's words the night she took her first steps, saying that when she could walk, she would run to hug him first. He couldn't die here. He couldn't let Rosalie lose her only father. Couldn't leave Ava alone to face this dark world. With his last strength, Lorenzo pulled the small knife hidden in his boot, the one Marco had taught him always to carry, and drove it into Victor's leg. As his enemy collapsed in pain, Lorenzo grabbed the fallen gun and pressed the barrel to Victor's forehead. He said it was for his father and for his family. The gun fired and Viktor Koslov fell to the floor, eyes staring at the ceiling. 20 years of hatred ended by a single bullet through his head. Lorenzo stood for a second, making sure the enemy was truly dead, then turned to Ava and Rosalie. He collapsed to his knees, blood still flowing from his shoulder, but none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the 2 figures running toward him. Rosalie threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing. The small legs that once couldn't move now carrying her to the person she loved most. Ava wrapped her arms around both of them, tears streaming down her face, and Lorenzo held them, as if he would never let go. They sat there amid the wreckage and the dead. 3 broken people clinging to one another, as if it were the only thing keeping them alive. And perhaps it truly was. The weeks following the attack became a gradual rebirth for Blackwood Manor, rising slowly from ashes that still smelled of smoke and loss. Lorenzo was rushed to a private hospital that very night. The bullet lodged in his shoulder removed after a 3-hour surgery. The doctors said he was fortunate. The bullet had missed the main artery, and with a few weeks of rest, he would recover fully. But wounds of the body healed far faster than wounds of the soul. For the first 2 weeks, Rosalie was plagued by nightmares every night. She woke screaming, calling for her father, calling for Ava. Terrified that the bad men would come back. Ava moved into Rosalie's room and slept beside her, holding the child whenever the nightmares struck, singing the same lullabies she once sang to Ethan. And little by little, the terrifying darkness began to loosen its grip. Marco Santini recovered from his shoulder wound and returned to work with loyalty deeper than ever before. 12 bodyguards had died during the attack, and Lorenzo personally visited each of their families, ensuring their wives and children would be cared for the rest of their lives. The mole was uncovered. A guard hired only 6 months earlier, who had sold information to Viktor Klov for $100,000. Marco dealt with him quietly, and no one asked what became of him. But the attack changed Lorenzo in ways no one expected. 1 month later, after his wounds had healed, and Blackwood Manor had been restored, Lorenzo summoned all his senior men to the grand meeting room of the estate. These were men who had followed him for more than a decade, who had helped him build the empire, who had been ready to die for him. Lorenzo looked each of them in the eye before saying something none of them had anticipated. He announced that he was withdrawing from all illegal operations, his voice steady and without hesitation. From that day forward, the Blackwood Empire would transition completely into legitimacy. All illegal pharmaceutical distribution lines would be shut down or handed over. Blackwood Pharmaceuticals would become a clean company, completely clean. The room fell into stunned silence. Some exchanged doubtful glances, some whispered, and a few openly objected, speaking of revenue, of power, of enemies who would exploit the change. Lorenzo raised his hand and silenced them. He said he had lived in darkness for too long, that he had inherited the empire from his father and continued down the path that had been laid before him. But that path had nearly destroyed his family. He said he had a 4-year-old daughter who had just learned to walk. And he wanted her to grow up with a father she could be proud of. He wanted her to never fear that someone would come to kill her father or kill her because of the sins he had committed. He said the decision was final and would not change. Some men left, unwilling to accept a legitimate future. Most stayed out of loyalty, belief in his vision, or simple exhaustion from life in the shadows. Marco Santini was the first to step forward and shake Lorenzo's hand, saying with rare solemnity that he followed the man, not the empire. And wherever Lorenzo went, he would follow. The following spring, as roses bloomed once more in the garden, Lorenzo led Ava into the space Catherine had loved most. It was where they first spoke, where Lorenzo had confessed his feelings, where their most meaningful memories had taken root over the past year. Ava didn't realize the night would be different until Lorenzo knelt on the green grass holding a red velvet box. He spoke her name, his voice trembling with emotion that the cold king would once have never allowed. He told her she had arrived at Blackwood Manor as a stranger and become the entire world of him and his daughter. He told her she healed Rosalie's legs with love and patience, and healed his heart by showing him that even men like him were worthy of love. He acknowledged his dark past and unforgivable deeds and asked for the chance to spend the rest of his life becoming a man worthy of her. He asked her to be his wife. Ava stood there with tears streaming down her face, thinking of their journey. From the tense first interview to nights of shared confessions in the rose garden to the moment they nearly lost each other, she thought of Ethan, and she knew her brother would want her to choose happiness. Rosalie's voice rang out behind them, urging Ava to say yes, declaring she wanted Ava to be her mother, her small legs bouncing with excitement, blue eyes shining like stars. Ava laughed through her tears and nodded, saying yes, she agreed. Lorenzo slipped the diamond ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms as Rosalie ran to hug both of their legs. They were married that summer in the rose garden of Blackwood Manor, where Catherine rested. It was an intimate ceremony, attended only by those closest to them, without extravagance or display. Rosalie served as flower girl, wearing a white dress and carrying her basket, as she ran across the grass on legs doctors once said would never move. As Lorenzo and Ava exchanged vows, as they kissed beneath arches of white roses and applause, Rosalie ran to them and shouted that now they were a real family. And they were a family built not from blood or obligation, but from love, sacrifice, and faith in miracles. 5 years have passed since the wedding in the Rose Garden, and Blackwood Manor is no longer a fortress of darkness. It has become a symbol of hope and miracles. Lorenzo kept his promise. The Blackwood Empire transitioned fully into legitimacy, and Blackwood Pharmaceuticals became one of the most respected pharmaceutical companies in the United States, leading groundbreaking research in neurology and rehabilitation. But the greatest legacy Lorenzo and Ava gave the world was not pills or scientific papers. It was the Blackwood Center for Pediatric Neurology, a place that changed the lives of hundreds of children once declared hopeless. The center was founded 1 year after the wedding, beginning as a single wing of Blackwood Manor transformed into therapy rooms. Ava designed the entire program herself, blending the magical play method she created for Rosalie with the latest scientific research on neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire and heal itself. Lorenzo funded everything and used his connections to bring the world's top specialists into collaboration. News of Rosalie's miraculous recovery spread through medical circles and families with disabled children. And soon calls for help poured in from across the United States. The first case beyond Rosalie was a 7-year-old boy named Michael, paralyzed from the neck down after a car accident. His parents came to Blackwood after hearing whispers of a miracle from a friend at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Ava worked with Michael using the same approach she used with Rosalie, turning every exercise into a game, never telling him he was in therapy. After 2 months, Michael moved a finger. After 4 months, he sat up. After 6 months, his parents sobbed as they watched their son take his first steps since the accident. From that moment on, the Blackwood Center expanded without pause. Lorenzo built a new facility covering more than 20,000 square meters outside Hartford. Fully equipped with the most advanced technology, staffed by doctors and physical therapists trained in Ava's method, and offering completely free treatment for families who couldn't afford care, Lorenzo declared he would devote half his fortune to ensuring no child would ever be turned away for financial reasons. 5 years after its founding, the Blackwood Center had helped 847 children regain motor function that traditional medicine had deemed impossible. That number was engraved on a bronze plaque in the main lobby, and every day it continued to grow. Ava became the scientific director of the center. She published 3 books on her method, lectured at Harvard, Stanford and Johns Hopkins, and trained hundreds of physical therapists from around the world. The World Health Organization studied her work and recommended its integration into standard pediatric rehabilitation protocols. But what made Ava proudest wasn't recognition or awards. It was Ethan's photograph hanging in every therapy room beneath the words "for my brother," who inspired it all. Every time she looked at that photo, Ava knew she had kept her promise to Ethan. Not by saving him, but by saving hundreds of other children in his place. Rosalie, now 9 years old, was no longer the shy little girl in a wheelchair staring out the window with sad eyes. She became the living symbol of the Blackwood Center, proof that miracles exist for those who believe and refuse to give up. Rosalie didn't just walk normally. She ran. She jumped. And most importantly, she danced ballet. The dream she once whispered to Ava 5 years earlier about dancing like princesses in movies had come true. She studied at one of Connecticut's most prestigious ballet schools. And while she wasn't the most naturally gifted student, she was the most determined. Her ballet instructor said she had never seen a child love ballet so deeply. And when she learned Rosalie's story, she cried. A video of Rosalie performing at the U-End recital was posted on the Blackwood Center's social media page and spread around the world. Millions watched a girl once declared permanently paralyzed spin across the stage in a pink tutu. And millions cried along with Lorenzo and Ava seated in the front row. But the Blackwood family's miracle didn't end there. 3 years after the wedding, Ava gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And they named him Thomas after Ava's grandfather, whom she never had the chance to meet. Thomas is now 2 years old with black hair like his father and warm brown eyes like his mother. Playful, energetic, and adored endlessly by his sister, Rosalie. Rosalie treats Thomas like her most precious treasure, playing with him every day, reading to him every night, and chasing him through the house as he learned to crawl and then toddle on unsteady feet. Lorenzo often stands in the doorway watching his children play and wonders if this is all a dream. 5 years ago, he was the cold king, a lonely mafia boss with a daughter in a wheelchair and a heart that died with his late wife. Now he is a husband, a father to 2 beautiful children, and the founder of a center that transformed the lives of hundreds of families. The miracle was not only that Rosalie learned to walk. The miracle was that his entire life was rewritten by a woman from the slums of Baltimore, carrying a battered suitcase and a heart full of love. One summer afternoon, as the sunset painted the Connecticut mountains in soft shades of pink, and the roses in the garden bloomed at their fullest, the Blackwood family gathered around the dining table on the veranda, as they did every day. Lorenzo sat at the head of the table, Ava beside him, Rosalie and Thomas facing each other, and laughter flowed freely through the warm evening meal. Thomas, 2 years old, was determined to feed himself with his small spoon, spilling rice everywhere and sending Rosalie into fits of laughter. Lorenzo watched the scene with a quiet, satisfied smile, a smile he once believed he had forgotten how to wear 5 years earlier. In the middle of the meal, Rosalie suddenly set her chopsticks down and asked a question that made both Lorenzo and Ava pause. She asked if they remembered when she couldn't walk. Lorenzo and Ava exchanged a glance that carried an entire journey within it, filled with tears and pain, but also overflowing with love and miracles. Ava placed her hand over Rosalie's and spoke gently, telling her that what mattered wasn't remembering when she couldn't walk, but celebrating everything she had achieved since then. She reminded her that she had walked, she had run, she had danced, and she had inspired hundreds of other children to believe that miracles were real. Lorenzo nodded and lifted Thomas onto his lap as the little boy began to squirm. He told Rosalie that every child carries the ability to create miracles within themselves, that all they need is someone who believes in them strongly enough to help them discover it, and that her mother, Ava, was the one who believed in her when the entire world had already given up. Rosalie smiled, her blue eyes just like Catherine, shimmering under the soft lights, and said that she loved them both, and that she would try to become someone like Mama Ava, so she could help children who were once like her. That night, after both children had fallen into deep sleep, Lorenzo and Ava sat together in their favorite living room, looking out at the rose garden through the wide glass doors. Stars glittered across the Connecticut sky, and a deep peace wrapped Blackwood Manor like a warm blanket. Lorenzo asked if Ava had ever imagined her life would look like this, his hand holding hers tightly. Ava smiled and rested her head against his shoulder, saying she never had, but that was the miracle of life, that we can never know what waits ahead. Yet, if we never give up, miracles will find their way to us. Lorenzo kissed his wife's forehead. And in that moment, he knew he had found the true meaning of life. Not money, not power, not the fear of enemies, but love, family, and the ability to change other people's lives through kindness and patience. Rosalie, the little girl once declared she would never walk, was now sleeping peacefully in her room with her ballet shoes placed beside the bed, ready for practice the next day. Thomas slept in his crib, dreaming the sweet dreams of childhood. And Lorenzo, the man once known as the Cold King, was now simply a husband and a father, waking each morning to the simplest joy of seeing the people he loved most. The story of the Blackwood family proves something we sometimes forget in our busy lives. No one is entirely good or entirely evil, and everyone has the capacity to change if they find a reason strong enough to do so. Love can heal the deepest wounds, and miracles aren't something that happens in an instant. They are built day by day through patience, acts of love, and moments of refusing to give up even when the entire world has turned away. If this story of miracles has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you won't miss future emotional stories. A like and a share from you will help us bring these meaningful stories to many more people. We would truly love to know how you feel about the story of Lorenzo, Ava, and little Rosalie. Do you believe in miracles in real life? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something that seemed impossible, but ultimately happened? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We always want to listen to what comes from the deepest parts of your hearts. Finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health, a peaceful life, and happiness each day. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.